Waiting room is open. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space, and thank you so much for joining us for today's event, part of Catalyst, the 2024 Master of Design Research Creation Symposium. Today's event, Thoughts on Design Education, Radical Pedagogy. To help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube and we are live from Fourth Space. We are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Chichage, Montreal. Here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge by co-creating daily activities that examine research questions, projects, things in development across the university. And we're running today's event as a live stream Zoom meeting, so we welcome comments, questions in the chat. Those of you in the space, of course, if you'd like to participate, just let us know, raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. With that, it's my pleasure to hand it over to MDes candidate, or if not, finalist, Raphael Vien. Welcome.
Thank you for everyone for coming today. I'd like to thank Kathy and Chinouk who are online with us today. Thank you so much for being here. It's Mila and Jason who are with us.
Just unmute there.
Am I amazing? Yeah. Okay, so I'll start over. So hi, my name is Raphael. I would like to start by thanking Chinouk and Kathy for being here with us today online, and to Mila and Jason for being here with us at Fourth Space. As Doug mentioned, the panel is called Thoughts on Design Education, Radical Pedagogy. In this panel, composed of academic professionals, we will be talking about the reality of educating the next generation of designers. I would like to invite each of our panelists to present themselves, a bit about why they are educators and how they're educators, actually. And so I'll leave the microphone to Kathy, if you can start off.
Thank you so much for inviting me here today. I'm Dr. Kathy Moscou. I was not prepared for this question. However, I would say that I firmly believe that it's important to make a difference and to be able to do that through a pathway of educating the next generation of designers, but the next generation of thoughtful individuals who are seeking to make a change in whatever area in which they are taking, whichever pathway that they choose. I am both an educator, I am also a creative, having a creative practice, wearing multiple hats, ranging from design to art to pharmacy and health education. And so I think that there is that space in which to holistically address the issues which are impacting us today through that cross-fertilization of ideas, which I think is really important. That's an important role for me as an educator in order to hopefully get my students to think about. And so again, I am passionate about trying to make that difference. So that is probably the reason for why I got into education and why I stay in education. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for answering. Such a thoughtful answer. Hello, Chinouk. Nice to see you after all these years. I'm happy you could be here with us today. If you could just introduce yourself quickly and just give us a bit of, I know you're teaching in many places at the same time. You've been teaching over the past years. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Chinouk Filique. I'm a design researcher and critical fashion practitioner, and I'm currently a professional doctor candidate at Artes University, where I also lecture in the critical fashion practices MA program, and I also tutor at the BA program, advertising and beyond at Willem de Koning Academy. Both of these are situated in the Netherlands. I often get invited to other educational institutes such as Parsons and UDK in Berlin to host workshops and lectures. So I'm in dialogue with students a lot, which I really enjoy. There wasn't necessarily a moment where I specifically chose the role of a tutor or educator, but having a artistic research practice, I feel like I also learn a lot from being in constant dialogue with students. And I think that's a very important and necessary part of my practice. So yeah, I'll keep it short.
Thank you for
Thank you.
this thoughtful list. I didn't know you were involved in so many projects at once, but I appreciate it. I will pass the microphone to Jason.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Raf. I'm happy to be here and appreciate the invitation. So I'm Jason Lewis. I teach here in the Design and Computation Arts department. And most of my career has been focused on interactive digital computational media of one sort or another. And a lot of the work that I do, particularly in the last 15 years, has been focused on the intersections between those technologies and indigenous cultural practices and knowledge practices. So I co-direct a project called Abundant Intelligence right now, which is an international research network looking at how to develop new forms of artificial intelligence from indigenous perspectives. And I also co-direct the Indigenous Futures Research Center here at Concordia. So I think for me, being an educator is about opening up possibilities and opportunities for my students and for my research assistants. I think that for me, that was one of the profound differences that educators made in my life at key moments, was to sort of show me that there was a world or worlds beyond the particular world in which I found myself at that time. And so had very positive effects for me, and sort of opened up ways of being in the world that were simply not visible to me where I came from, because nobody was doing that sort of thing. And it didn't seem possible for somebody like me to do that sort of thing. So that's sort of a big driving force behind why I continue to be an educator, but in thinking about how I try to educate and how do I try to work with students. What is the goal? What is it that I'm trying to make happen with them?
Thank you very much. Milan, if you want to share a few words about your practice and your experience.
Hi, Raf. Hi, everyone else. Hi, the audience. My name is Milan. I just want to first thank Raf for inviting me. Really appreciate having this opportunity to discuss education with other teachers and students, I guess. So my background is in fashion design. I graduated in university in fashion design, and then I had my own company for 8 years. Following that venture, I just met my most influential design teacher that I had during university, and she gave me an opportunity to co-teach a class with her at university level. And it was, like an interesting experience for me at that time. Like, I wasn't necessarily ready for becoming a teacher, but I enjoyed it. And ever since, like, it's been 15 years since that, I teach fashion design at university level and at college level. I'm a lecturer. And 5 years ago, in my spare time, I also found that there's a gap or there's a lack of bridge between finishing up your education and design and transitioning towards having your own practice. So with the help of many others, I created an organization called Linde Fuit. It's a talent incubator. It basically provides mentoring. It provides affordable space as well for designers. It provides visibility, sales opportunities for young designers. So this is sort of Also, a little bit how I met Raphael. He was a student at UQAM, and together we designed Lindefied Volume 3. So he was the art director. And this is the kind of opportunities I'd like to provide for young people where with a little bit of budget and lots of love, like we're able to create something impressive and like give them a space like where they could continue practicing, because outside of school, I find like it's very difficult to do it without support. So this is sort of what I've been doing in my spare time, and maybe unlike everyone else, like here in the professors, I'll maybe share more of a perspective of someone, of something that is a bit outside of or on the side of education, but collaborating with the schools and so on. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Great, thank you, Milan. There's a reason why my colleagues and I chose these panelists for our talk today. And so initially this was supposed to be a faculty panel, and so we were thinking about having our profs from the department join us for this talk about education. But it felt kind of weird to only have teachers from Concordia talk about the future of education, since it's quite an isolated bubble in a way. And so we reached out to other contacts. In my case, I brought my fashion contacts along, such as Milan and Chinouk, and then Tarcisio proposed that we invite Kathy as well. And so I'm really happy to have this diverse board to talk about fashion education, about design education, because it is not specific to one domain, but to every domain, and to have all these different point of views. I myself wanted to host this talk because I am quite passionate about the future of design education. I am recently a design tutor, and so I really want to further my knowledge on how to educate the future generation, including myself, through the teaching of these kids, these students, these people. And I wanted to thank Milan, because it is because of Milan that I'm here today, that I've completed my master's degrees. He used to be my mentor when I was at university, and he really gave me all the opportunities that I needed to be able to be where I am today. And so thank you to Milan. I have a first question that is a tricky one, and it is the one that I asked to all our panelists today. And so, how does one define good design these days? I don't know if someone wants to take the floor on this one.
Risky territory.
Chinouk, as a designer yourself, practitioner, and someone who sees a lot of students in different universities, how would you define good design today?
Yeah, I think it was the hardest question that you posed, to be very honest, because I think it's too broad of a question for me to attempt to answer. But when I personally think of good design, I think of design that takes its context into consideration. So design that is sustainable in every sense of the word. So it's materiality, but also sustainable in terms of longevity. Yeah, but what is good differs for each discipline and its practical use, in a sense. So I want to reiterate that there is no good for all. There's only good depending on context. That's where I'm at.
And I would like to pick up on that, because I think that's a really important point to say about good for context. I actually think the question is not how does one define good design, but rather who is a designer, and for whom do designers design? What impact do designs have? How and why? Because I would say that design is a form of activism, and designers do always impart their perspectives in each of the designs that they create. And I don't care which field that is, whether it's consciously or unconsciously. And as such, it's really important for designers to reflect on the potential for social and or political impact of their designs, the potential to perpetuate inequities in their designs, and that design is for purpose, whether we understand that or not. So whether or not it's sustainable or not sustainable. Again, whether it reinforces stereotypes, and that I think that certainly this title of this panel is about radical pedagogy, and I would say that I include in that activist design, which then goes beyond aesthetic, but is design that promotes social change or fosters agency to solve identified problems or intervenes to address it, and opens new possibilities.
Thank you to the both of you for those amazing responses. I don't know if anyone wants to add.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose mine's a riff off of that. So I think these days, good design is messy. So it takes into account local contexts, like they've been saying, and it doesn't try to homogenize people into particular categories, but really tries to attend to the specific things that they've already mentioned. And I think that particularly with the technologies we have these days, the opportunities for doing that are quite fulsome. There's lots of interesting ways of going about that that might have been difficult or impossible previously, but also very dangerous, as we've seen too, in the sense that they can also these tools for amplifying our ability to actually address individuals and specific communities also can be used to amplify bias and prejudice and things like that. So we have to be very sort of conscious and mindful in how we go about employing them.
Thank you.
Well, I agree with like everyone is saying, like what is difficult today is actually to define like what good design is, but I think that's the beauty of it. Like there's like a room for diversity inside like what good design is. Personally, like when I as a teacher, I find it's difficult for us like being in that situation because we have like little criterias like to judge what is good design. Personally, like maybe I can share like my strategy of sort of like assessing if something is good. So I try to have like empty shells, like in terms of, you know, like empty kind of like big words like that describe like certain categories. So for my students, I often tell them that basically I need their design to be at the intersection of art, craft, and fashion, or we can understand in this situation in design. And I am also pushing for the students to bring something new and original as well. So in terms of craft, basically I'm trying to assess like whether the design is difficult to produce. So I'm interested in this aspect of like making and like is the making actually difficult. In terms of design, I approach it basically from, you know, like classical function. Does the design like address like the proper needs and so on? So it's very like function-based design. But I also leave that other aspect, which is like the art. Design, in my opinion, could be used to communicate, could be used to address the issues, could be a way to create discourse or to speculate about the future and so on. So there's like this also this aspect of design that of a good design, which is the artistic aspect that I try to kind of like explain the students. And I'm looking for some kind of an intersection of these like three aspects. Plus I'm looking for at least originality, which to me means that it's authentic to whoever is designing. But I expect like from some students also some level of creativity and innovation. I think like by having these like broad system of categories, I've been able to sort of gauge whether the projects are good. But I tend to stay outside of ideologies, and I don't tend to kind of like because design is always becoming like the same thing as with ideologies. They're always becoming, they're always changing. So I don't want to be in my classroom someone that prevents like new ideas. So I try to kind of like stay with these broad categories, but honestly it's difficult like these days and as a teacher to assess what is actually good design. I don't know if my colleagues have anything, any tricks about assessing that, but in my case it's been difficult.
Kathy and Chinouk, does anybody want to add anything to Milan's topic?
Yeah, I was thinking that I agree that it's becoming harder and harder to assess what is good based on the end result. So with my educational role, if you could call it that. I think there's also a question that you prepared on this, but there's very much a focus on the process and the maker or the student or the participant of the course being able to articulate why certain design decisions were made and for whom. And I think that is very valuable for me, maybe the highest ranking element for me to assess if something is quote unquote good. Yeah.
I agree. I have maybe a follow-up question for the four of you again on what you just mentioned, Chinouk. The question is, do you believe that the importance of a unique design process exceeds the design result?
So for me, that's a full yes. Yeah. Maybe yeah. I think it again depends on, of course, the context in which you're working, but in the end, I think the process has way more added value to the learning curve of a student than the end product. So in both programs where I'm involved in, the BA and the MA, there's a very strong focus on process and being able to articulate it. So yeah, because here I think it also has to do maybe with the context of the Netherlands. It's a natural course of action for a designer to go freelance after their education. So there's also this need for the designer to have the ability to independently navigate this design process. And it's almost seen as a unique selling point. And it also caters a bit to the state of the design, the design field here, and which also is heavily based on funding applications in which you need to describe why your design process differs or is valuable for the discipline as a whole. And in some cases, the process is the result. So I really try to instill it with students that they need to be attentive to their process and make it their own, and to be able to communicate that, because it's what will make your outcome unique and in the end also more sustainable for yourself as a design practitioner.
Agreed. Does anybody want to add to this? Amazing. Go ahead.
Maybe I'd like to add something about like the design process itself. Like I still think like the result is important, but through the process, like we can achieve like really interesting end results. One of the basically like the way I approach it is that the design process is relatively universal. There is like universal steps. But the design viewpoint of the student, the sources, the people they work with, the community around like the designer, I find like this is responsible for making a great end product at the end, and it's really as teachers like we can't we teach process basically, and at the end of the day like the results are always experimental in the sense that this is not a finished product. So I always tend to give like more emphasis on evaluating the process over the final result. However, I do feel that like when our students leave university and they go into other situations where the final result like matters more than the process itself, I find that it takes them a certain adjustment, and I feel like as professors and as people who are educating like designers that will be working in industry eventually, I feel that we should not let go also of the expectations in terms of like a well done finished project, and to have certain expectations also of the final outcome, because I've been in the past 5 years, I've seen at least in my students a certain let go in terms of like the final outcome. Maybe that's due to our emphasis on process. So I'm maybe currently looking at bringing back like the importance also of a final result in my own practice. So I kind of see a little bit of an issue with like how of the project at the end.
Yeah, what I was going to add is is that I do really believe in process within an education environment, but also part of the process is recognizing when you've made when there's a good outcome, right? So your ability to look at what comes out at the end and be like, oh, okay, that worked well, that didn't work well, it responds to, it's fit for purpose, or it responds to what the client or my collaborator or whatever it is, or even it corresponds to what I imagined at the beginning of this, or deviates in a way that I can sort of narrate and motivate. Because I agree that I also find sometimes like emphasizing the process sometimes, and also there's this, I think, constant back and forth about kind of fit and finish of not. And I think I was like this when I was a young designer in grad school, like not taking that seriously. But then being outside and understanding actually how much it can be an indicator to people about your process and about your thinking and about the rigor that you approach the project. So it's actually not just something superficial you take care of at the end, but actually it reflects back on how you've approached the entire project. And so I think trying to communicate to that to students is very important to me.
I agree. On the same idea, obviously we're focusing on the design process when we're teaching, but we also need to focus on design history, obviously, because as designers we're making something new, but it's based off of things that already exist. And so on this topic, I would like to ask a question to Jason. How much of design history is needed to design for the future, and what history should we teach? And please, the other members can chime in as well.
Yeah, this is a good question. So I think one way to answer that question is you need to know enough design history, but history to understand how contingent everything is. So all these things that we see around us that have been nicely designed, the ones we like, the ones we don't like, but they're all the result of accumulation of a series of decisions made by human beings. And those human beings are subject to all the forces that we're subject to, things going on in our personal life, the political environment, the actual physical environment that we're in, what's happening in the larger context around them, what's being rewarded, what's being discouraged. And that it's one of the things I love about design is the fact that you can sort of step back and really, I think a good design education teaches you to step back and to sort of start deconstructing how it is that this object came to be, right? And that's the first step of thinking through how it could be done differently. And then that's a step on the way to imagining things kind of radically differently, is understanding where things that you might have assumed were truths about the world are not actually truths. They're a story that somebody told, and people believe that story, and enough people believe that story that it became like a truth, but it's actually not a truth. So it's a consensus. And so you can test whether that consensus is something that you think should hold, that you understand why that consensus is what happened, and then sort of test it against your present reality to try to understand whether it's a consensus that is fit for purpose in your present context and in your present time, and to think about how you might go about doing things differently if you take on a different set of assumptions.
I really appreciate that answer, and I strongly agree with what you have just said. When I think of design, I think of it quite broadly. I think of fashion design, and I think of product design, and I think of UX UI design, but I also think of policy design and structural design and systems design. And all of those things are actually really important in understanding of the history and those assumptions that are made and how it is that we came to understand the world that we are in today. And and it definitely impacts the things in which we design. And so designing alternative futures requires a critical analysis of those kinds of structures and those policies in order to deconstruct and understand why that hegemony exists the way that it does exist, and so that we can think about the redesigns that are necessary for the futures that we are envisioning. So the fact that, we have a minimalist design in items, comes from a whole Bauhaus tradition. Why did that come to be? Are those the only kinds of designs that are functional? And is minimalist the only we've been doing that for years now, and we're still doing a lot of minimalist design, but there are a whole other there are whole other design frameworks, and there are whole other understandings of what design is that we as educators, I think it's important to bring that into what it is that we teach. And so, when you think about, the Global South, what kind of designs that are going on there, and how do we bring that in order to, again, to interrogate the histories that we have been taught such that we can create different design futures.
Very well said. Milan, did you want to add anything?
Well, maybe I'll speak from like a college perspective right now, because it's my daily reality. I find like my college students don't know anything about design precedents. Like they don't know almost nothing about the things that they use as inspiration. I find it's a huge issue. I find that my students reinvent the wheel constantly, and I am sort of like I don't understand like why this is happening to that extent, and I really feel like it's not just about introducing history or in-depth analysis, historical analysis in university. I think like it should be brought in like much earlier, even at like high school level, and then from high school level to CEGEP level. Like I think like this is like a huge issue, because like I know like you're gonna ask questions about unlearning later on, but my students generally have no clue about anything that they're looking at when they design, they're looking at design precedents. They're just looking shapes and things like that. So that I don't know what the answer is, but I just wanted to state that it's a huge issue.
I agree with you, Milan. Did you want to add anything, Kathy?
I was just going to suggest that I think that when we observe those kinds of things, that I think one of the things that we can do is to help our students to understand, well, why is that shape the way that it is? And in the activities and that we provide for them to do is part of that learning process. And so by the time that they leave us, that they are able to for themselves, back to this idea of process, and being, that's part of the process in order to help them become better designers.
That's a very good point. Following this question, I have another one for you, Kathy. As interim dean of the Faculty of Design, I am questioning myself. I teach to a younger generation since it's a CEGEP level, and a lot of them find their information online and sort of find their knowledge where they can. And to this, I would like to ask you if self-education is the new education, and what role do institutes play within this?
Oh, that's a really good question. And I've been in education for a very long time, and I would say self-education is not new. Self-education has been important and has been, we hope, to teach for a very long time. I think that academic institutions and myself as an interim dean have a responsibility in order to build capacity for lifelong learning, and self-education is part of that lifelong learning, but it doesn't mean that it's not directed. And so we want to be able to foster self-directed learning. And that's core in helping students, I think, to, again, evaluate where they're getting the information. I'm probably the one who says, like, don't look at Wikipedia, you know. But it's important to to understand what are the sources of the information that you're looking at. And so not everything that you read on the internet or everything that you see is actually truth. Back to the last question, whose truth? But I do think that I think that is what's really important though is to create is to share or impart the tools for evaluating the things that you are self-learning, rather than to say that self-learning is something that one should not do. Because I actually do believe that we want to continue to foster self-directed learning, but we do want we do want within the academy, in order for students to understand the materials that they're reading, to interrogate the materials that they're reading, and the visuals that they are seeing as well.
It's a very good point. Does anybody feel like adding to this question?
Yes. So I agree with everything Kathy said. And then when I was thinking about that question, I was thinking about the ways in which we will continue to need educators. So the places where self-education is not necessarily gonna cut it. And I think part of that is I think the value of having somebody who can connect the dots between sort of what is being taught and their sort of understanding of you and what you want to be doing in the world. I think that's a really critical and important role, whether it's formally as a teacher or as a mentor or as a tutor or something like that. Really, you know, and this comes from trying to think through in the whole big debates about online learning and how much learning can be disaggregated out of a place like this and provided online, and what is it that the university is really good at, and that we can stand on solid ground. And for me, that's one of the things that I think is really important. And I think it's unfortunate that it feels like it's a privilege, but it's a privilege of working within fine arts faculties, is that the classes tend to be small enough that you can do that in a much greater to a much greater extent than in lots of other places of the university where you're dealing with very large classes, and it's not maybe the same kind of mentality. And I also think this is connected in with like good critique, and using good critique to understand what it is your students are trying to do, like with themselves as humans, not just like with that particular design brief.
Maybe what I'd like to add is that I'm seeing that basically information is true, it's abundant, it's everywhere, it's readily available, but attention is not. So I feel like as educators, or at least personally, I've tried to address the issue of attention. How can I grab people's attention, or how can I put them in a hyper focus so they could have these like self-directed studies? And I feel like there's a lot of work in general in the classroom, like that has to do with attention. Short attention spans is one issue, but it's sometimes it's very difficult to deal with this. I'm currently experimenting with shorter projects, sometimes longer projects broken into many little small parts. I'm constantly experimenting because I'm not seeing necessarily better results because information is all available and it's like readily out there. So I think it has to do something with attention, and we haven't figured it out, like in my opinion, like as teachers. So there's a lot more to work and to do. And I was always wondering, like, also if like I'm trying to, I catch myself thinking like, oh, this new generation, like I can't deal with them anymore, or something like this. Like they don't have that level of commitment, let's say. But then I step out and I say, okay, what can I do to make the classroom work and for them to achieve good results? So I see that I can do better, like in terms of like attention, for example, and I have ideas and I experiment them in my classrooms and outside of the classroom as well. So
Mhm.
For me, like the issue is attention, and the information is there, but it's not really used.
That's
I would
a
like
valid point.
If it's okay, I would like to add to what's being said and to what it is that I have said as well, is that oftentimes when we think about self-directed learning, we think of that I'm going to go to the YouTube channel and I'm going to learn. But that's not the only space in which we do self-directed learning. And so I would pair that along with sort of experiential learning. And experiential learning doesn't mean that often what it is that we are doing activities with we're learning from others, in a practice kind of setting, or maybe it's in a collaborative type of a setting. And so that is not necessarily direct knowledge sort of poured into one's head, but rather it is finding the resources to be an effective collaborator and to be an effective member of a design team. And I think that that part of learning tends to be overshadowed by the thought that self-directed or self-education means online, because it doesn't have to mean that at all. It's really just about how it is that we are supporting and building capacity for lifelong learning.
It's a very good point. Following this idea of sorry, of finding information sort of anywhere we can, and I have a question for Chinouk. I know you are familiar with the digital world. I know your work is also familiar with it. And so I would like to ask you, how can students generate authentic thinking in algorithm-led world? And how can we teach authentic thinking?
I think it very much builds on what everybody was saying in reaction to the previous question, because I think self-education, or I would rather call it self-exploration, grows in tandem with me trying to navigate a student or trying to figure out what a student's interest or intrinsic urgencies are in order to then propel them to self-educate. And I think the online space, while it doesn't necessarily mean it's the only space to self-educate, it does help those who are not very prone to linear forms of education, because it builds or it sustains this hypertextual non-linear pathway that some students just need because they sometimes have a shorter attention span. So to deal with, for instance, an algorithm-led world, I think the key is digital literacy and to be able to understand algorithmic realism and to generate some form of agency within that realism, and to approach and employ algorithmic technologies and tools not as an end-all be-all, but as part of the process. So again, authentic for me is such a crazy broad concept, especially in the discipline of fashion. I think it has maybe even a paradoxical connotation, or maybe it has lost a bit of its value in a sense. Also because the way that fashion media deals with the word authentic itself, because it's a commodified word, so I tend to not use it. And while I think authentic thinking, in a sense, starts from self. Being able to trace citation and multi-authorship and apply cross-disciplinary thinking, which are very much collective concepts, allows one to generate novel and personal perspectives, which in the end then again amounts to authentic. So it's very circular. I think it starts with knowing how algorithms work and how one can apply an algorithmic environment, or in deal with it or insert themselves and their work within that environment. I hope this wasn't too much of a ramble.
That was amazing, actually. Does anybody want to bounce off of Chinouk's sentences? Okay, no, excellent. In this case, speaking about authentic thinking, I have a trick question for Milan. I know that this was really important for me when I was in my undergraduate studies and even here at my master's. This idea of building a design persona, so an identity sort of that is myself, that is outside of myself, one that I respect through my design process, which includes values, aesthetics, and so on. And so to Milan, I'm asking if building a design persona is important for young designers.
When I was at Concordia, I read Gilles Deleuze, and basically I understood something about difference in itself. And I kind of like, I'm not sure if I'm right, if I correctly understood, but I really understood it as like difference in itself is the designer. And I always thought that it would be interesting for me to push students push students to kind of like figure out like their values and experiment with their own appearance and their own basically lifestyle and exhibit those values through being who they are. So I've one of the things that I've also noticed, like that in Europe, European design education, often like they judge authenticity also by juxtaposing the work and the designer next to each other, and it becomes very personal, the comments like you are not that work, or you don't look like that work, or things like that. So I was influenced both by this idea of like difference in itself, like and from there, basically, I've been pushing students to have like a persona. And I think like that, at the end of the day, it helps them also in terms of linking their work and having like some, being at the origin of their own work. So this is maybe the reason why I like push for personas and so on. And I can't help myself, but like sometimes I see students that they are just not their work, and it bothers me, like, and I say things about it. So that's the first one.
Would anybody like to add?
Yeah, I can speak from European context in this sense. I think it is especially the case when the person is in appearance and in design aesthetic of the self is very loud, but the work is not, rather than when it's the other way around. So when the work is very solid and the person behind it is more presents themselves more muted. But it's very interesting to hear Milan's Deleuze connection. I think it's always helpful to train your self-reflexive muscle as a designer, and I think building or thinking about a persona or an alter ego for that matter helps. And I mean, especially in fashion, I think for some it might really help with getting traction or attention towards your work and or design philosophy, because you then embody that. So I think it's a good exercise in self-reflection for everyone, as it might help to become aware of what you want and your urgencies, and being able to communicate those to a wider audience through your work, but also through the self.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective, because when I looked at this question, I thought of it from an entirely different vantage point. And so what I hear now is a conversation around design authorship. How does one develop their own personal identity and bring that actually into the work that they are creating, so that it does, back to this idea of authentic, that it's authentically you. But personas, when I think of it, are used in a lot of different design practices, from industrial design to whatever, in which one is doing research on a created persona, in which one is designing their brief around a particular type of persona. And I guess the question is when we're thinking about personas, what are people's thoughts in regards to that? I mean, the challenge when we're creating personas for other people, not ourselves, are we perpetuating or building in biases about what we think those type of people are like? And so so when I think about this idea of personas, and personas, when they reinforce stereotypes, are problematic. When it's creating a self-identity and you are the person, that's an entirely different thing.
It's a very good point. Thank you, Kathy. We've been talking about students for a while, so now I want to talk about educators themselves. And so, Kathy, I have a specific question for you, which I hope everybody can chime in on. How do we educate educators?
The simple answer is the way we wish we had been educated when we were being taught, but we're not. I feel quite fortunate, in being at OCAD University, which I think is a vanguard for decolonizing design and indigenizing art and design education to advance equity. And to that end, we have we aim here to lead and to educate creative leaders that are resilient and flourish as they co-create equitable and just sustainable futures for all. That's actually in our academic strategic plan. And so then what is the incentivization then in order to educate teachers and educators in order to achieve those quite lofty goals for education? I mean, I, for one, was excited about the fact that we, in order to lead in that direction, have recently spearheaded the approval of a design in oh gosh, a Black history or Black studies design and art minor. And so within that, we have core courses that are offered in Black art and design practices and cultural history, critical theory, that enriches exploration of decolonized futures by bringing in voices of Black designers and artists. And it's the first Black studies design and art minor in an ACAD university in Canada. And so I think that to educate educators, though, in order to teach that next generation, that it's important, again, as I mentioned, to incentivize educators to update the pedagogy and to provide resources which will be able to expand their knowledge base. We all were trained in a certain in a certain way. When we are right now in our faculty challenging or interrogating sort of that Eurocentric model of education, of studio-based learning, in order to try and bring in new perspectives and different ways of doing it. And so I think, though, that we need to have some sort of mechanisms by which we are creating not only the structural supports for our faculty to be supported in adopting, taking on new what do I want to say, in challenging and thinking the way in which they teach, and then giving them the tools and the resources to be able to redesign their courses to make certain that they are fostering that sort of inclusiveness within their classrooms. I think that, yeah, I think that it's important, in order to provide sort of the educational tools, the educational models, provide concrete examples for educators in order to help to achieve the goals that the institution has, and it's important as an institution for us all to have embedded within our academic and strategic plan those ideas, because ultimately, as educators, we are all accountable and responsible for achieving the goals of our academic strategic plan. And so I think that that's a good place to start.
Would anybody like to chime in on this?
Maybe I'll just say that like I learned a lot of like a lot of teaching I learned from my peers basically, and I like if there's something that I recommend is having co-teaching. I think like co-teaching really helps. That is something that I am willing to do. But the institution itself, like where I teach, doesn't allow for this. Just it's about budget. It's about CI. It's about like your teaching load and things like that. But I think it would be great like if we can have like more co-teaching, like younger and an older teacher, for example, being paired together. I think this will be like awesome, because my main issue with our main issue where I teach is that we do not we lose a lot of the craft, the teaching craft. Like we lose it because the people go and retire. I know Kati is talking about like sort of like maybe introducing novel methods, but there's also a ton of like really good things that have been lost, like in where I personally teach, like because sewing or just putting a little eyelet somewhere. There's a lot of little things to know that are like tiny little things, but they get lost. And I personally blame this. One of the reasons for not achieving great results compared to, let's say, 5 years ago with our students is because we lost that knowledge. And it wasn't transmitted to me, it wasn't transmitted to Raf. And I feel sad that these teachers left and we have none of their knowledge now. So that's a suggestion,
Yeah, I think, oh, no, go ahead.
So
No,
I was so I was in industry for 12 years before I came into the university, and never really had planned on doing that. But what kind of was shocking to me was that even though there was some really lovely informal resources for learning how to teach from my colleagues like Martin when I came in, and Rona, who was here earlier, and Michael Longford, so people who had been in the department before me and made themselves available to me as I was trying to figure things out, that there wasn't any formal mechanism for doing that. And I think co-teaching is an amazing way to think about that and to think about how we can push our institutions to accommodate that better, because you're right, it's the same thing everywhere. They're just like, we can't afford that, and how do you divvy up workload, and there's all these sort of practical questions which are real, but also it's now it's 20 plus years later, and we haven't really feels like we haven't made a lot of movement on that. We do some co-teaching in our department, but my understanding is it's still always a bit of a struggle to sort of make it work. And but I think that doing more of that, where we have that ability to learn from our the people more established than us, and in a structured way, sort of every week, every couple days or whatever it is way, I think would be really critical.
Chinouk, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I was just going to stress this, the thing that Kathy said about the structural support of the faculty, and which all of you actually kind of mentioned, because what I see happening around me is that there are seminars and workshops and summits and symposiums that are instigated in order to create this temporary think tank to help motivate educators to adapt and grow and reassess their methods. But when staff is overworked to the point of burnout, it will reflect on the students, and they absorb this energy. So it's like it's a cycle, which is in the end it's just really sad. And I'm also now thinking of the system that they set up at the Critical Fashion Practice program is that they created a learning community, which is actually a course that invites alumni to come in and to teach a class or a workshop to the next generation of participants and to be in dialogue with the tutors and the lecturers to help assess what needs to change or what where they really benefited from, or how the educational system or the program reflects on what happens after in a very current or contemporary state of the design field. And I think it really helps to be realistic about what we think inside the institution and how it works or ripples outside into bigger, like a wider context. Yeah.
Yeah, those are really important points that you raised, Chinook, and I appreciate you mentioning sort of the availability of seminars and workshops and those things, which will help to build the skills. I also agree with the idea of mentoring junior faculty and providing mechanisms by which that can happen. Probably all of our institutions, I know our institution has, a teaching and learning centers, and I'm sure that Concordia also has teaching and learning centers that has these resources. But I think that there are ways in order to support faculty beyond just having those resources, but to value that one would go forward in getting this learning, additional learnings, despite the burnout, which you described, Chinook, which actually does happen. Anybody in an academic institution has to do teaching, service, and research or creative practice, and these are things that can be valued. Mentoring can be valued in your service, or depending upon if it's a highly qualified personnel, maybe it's a part of your teaching. I am thinking also that, professional development, which most of us have access to, these are the things in which we can get support for professional development to get this training, and that all will inform and better our creative practices or our research. And so I think when we talk about support, this is like, I was talking very sort of broad based in regards to that, but when we're thinking of support, these are the ways in which we can assure that that faculty get some of the extra support and training that they need. But I also want to emphasize is that it's important to think. I strongly believe in mentorship, but I think that we also want people to step outside to learn the skills that are being lost, yes, but also to not be in a thought bubble in which we are continuing to train the same way we were trained and will continue to train that way in perpetuity. And so we want to bring in those new ideas. And so how is it that we bring them in is our challenge.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you to everyone. We've been talking about teaching. I want to talk also about the industry because we've been mentioning it. When I was at school, we would tell us to think about how this will act in the industry, how we will perform in the industry, and how this product would sell or so on. But do you think that we could change the industry by the way we teach, instead of it being the other way around where we teach for the industry? Does anybody want to chime in on this? Mila, you want to give it a go?
I think both. Like, I'm gonna be a centrist, so like it's important to listen to the industry and adapt, the strategic plans also in relation to industry. But I also think, like, in the strategic plans of the institutions, there have to be also like embedded like change in the mindset of people. So I do find that my personal experience is that we lost Did we lose them?
I think it's just the screen. Can keep on.
Yeah. So basically, like I'm worried, like so we don't like take an extreme position, like where we forget industry. One of the reason why I'm worried when we forget the industry itself, because I often like meet students outside of my classroom, like let's say 3 years down the road, and I'm like really disappointed when I hear that they haven't like basically they haven't achieved prosperity. And I'm really worried about that personally, and I feel kind of like accountable in a way, like it bothers me. So I feel like as educators we cannot like afford to kind of like become like extremist or something like this, because our classroom is like composed of you know, like very different individuals that will have like completely different futures. So I think like during the past like 10 years, have emphasized a lot of like radical change, and but I am worried that these changes haven't delivered like the prosperity and the jobs for my students, and I see it by talking to the actual students. They're not having like they're not like prosperous, I don't know how to say. So I think we should worry about their future in that regard as well.
Kathy, do you have something to say about this?
I will, I guess I would say that change, I think, is motivated from within and from without, you know. And I would say that industry for a long time has been changing how we think about design, but we also can impact how industry thinks about design. If we're thinking of ourselves as creating that next generation of designers, that they're going to be the leaders of those industries someday. And so that means that over a course of time, it's not going to happen in a few years, but over a course of time, I think industry does change because of the people who move into the industry. And it changes in how it is that the way in which practice and culture within an industry is articulated, I think also begins at the educational level. And so if we change sort of practice and culture at the student and the institutional level, that it will actually eventually move into the industry level. Like I do agree with Milan that we actually do want to make certain that our students are leave our institutions with the skills requisite in order to practice within whatever industry that they are in. And we can do that in some ways by creating those internships and those opportunities for them actually to build those skills, not just in our classroom, but through, I think, that experiential learning. And that's another pathway by which the ideas for which they are being educated within our institutions actually also permeate into the industry as well. But I do think that we can be change agents, and we are, and that we have the opportunity to take the best of what that students need to learn from industry, but also to disrupt the things for which are problematic.
That was great. I really like both of those answers. It reminds me of my head tutor when I was at the Royal College of Art. Was a product designer named Colin Burns. And he used to always say to us that competency creates opportunity, right? And so what he was trying to say was, you know, look, you need to get the basic skills under your belt and to do them well, because if you are able to do that, then that will start creating opportunities for you to do things otherwise. So it's very difficult to just try to come in and do things otherwise from the get-go, as much as we might like to romanticize it differently. And particularly if you're interested in like long-term sustained change. And I think this is maybe what you meant, Kathy, when you were saying about it coming from within rather than from without, right? It's like you have to change the structures within the field, within the industry, so that the changes that you're trying to promote stick. Because you could come in from the outside, get everything sort of all riled up for a little bit, but then you're gonna go away eventually. You're gonna go do something else. You're gonna die, whatever it might be. And then the question is what remains from what you've tried to change after that? And there's a lot of infrastructure work and slow change that happens, that has to happen in order for that to do, or that to take hold, and that establishing yourself as competent in the field is a way that people start giving you opportunities to try to move things and change things, and kind of get towards the vision that you came in with.
Thank you. On the same idea, I would like to ask to all our members the following question. Do you believe in collective unlearning and collective undesigning? This is coming from a point of view of whatever we're sending out, obviously, in the industry doesn't always end up as we would like to. Our designer responsibilities. Do you think as universities, institutions, and such, we can teach this collective unlearning and emphasize it? Mila?
Well, basically, like I like at the core of everything that I do with my students is basically this idea of like going away from limits, and I know for a fact that a lot of the limits are learned in design, and they're like systemic and so on. Like so I completely understand, you know, like that how important it is to unlearn certain things, and deconstruction in general has been like kind of like my emphasis, let's say, like in everything that I've been doing with my students. Where I'm a little bit like worried, like and like I'm foreseeing issues is that basically if this becomes a norm, okay? If for example we teach our students only to deconstruct. Because like even if we through deconstruction we rebuild new ideas, I feel that like if the next generation only knows how to think through deconstruction, I think like these ideas will be simply like a revolution following by another revolution and nothing will be like sustained, changed, or something like this. So in my let's say past few years, I've started reading other things than deconstruction, because like honestly I'm like the product of like basically Concordia University, UQAM University. I've been taught like only to deconstruct, and I don't know anything else about design. So so I've been starting to learn about how I can put things together, how I can do collective action, how can something like have longevity, and I've been starting to get reinterested in like trend-based design, even though it's like so kind of not cool or something like this. But I thought about like that it would be really interesting to also teach students again how to iterate on an existing idea and kind of like bring slow changes instead of like necessarily a radical new design or something like this. I've also been like really interested in besides like unlearning and deconstruction, I've been interested in also perfection, something that I've never actually like cared about before, but in the sense that I've encountered like a couple of my students that, for example, they would take in an archetype and they would like begin perfecting that archetype through redoing, and so on. And I feel like we have to kind of like find a balance, because like the norm has become a revolution, and I feel like there is something about unlearning that there needs to be a follow-up. There needs to be something that will actually build these ideas into reality and make them democratic and so on, and through amplification. So I've been basically introducing like lately like trend-based designs and like things like that, just to to get some kind of a collective action going instead of having everyone try to reinvent the world. So.
Agreed. I'd be curious to get Jason's opinion on this.
So I mean, when I read the question, I realized I don't know if I really understood what unlearning and designing might mean. So I'm a bit lost there. I am interested in the first part of that question though, right? Which is, do you believe empathy and romanticism have a place in design education? Because I think that that's also something that gets lost in the revolutionary fervor. Is like, I mean, part of the reason why I'm in creative practice, and I think most of my peers when I was coming up, and my peers now, and also the students that I teach, like one of the motivating factors is a desire to sort of bring beauty into the world in some way, or bring delight, or bring pleasure, or bring like this, like create a positive effect on other people, on yourself, like designing something that you really like get that out of, but also for other people. And I think sometimes that, I mean, I think there's a grander modernist tendency to try to downplay that and be sort of skeptical of it. But I think it's something really important to think about how to nurture in yourself and nurture in our students. That is actually a really valuable thing to try to do in the world. The world is hard, it's cold, there's a lot of tragedy in it, and that one of the more glorious things we can do for ourselves and for and with other people is to figure out how to create more instances of beauty, however you define that. It could be beauty in a very aesthetic way, it could be beauty in the connection that you make with somebody, it could be beauty in doing something that you think is going to have a long-term positive effect that it's not even visible right now. There's lots of ways to think through beauty and understand it, but I think it's important to kind of name it as something that is worthwhile to do, that's hard to do well. And so how do you go about trying to figure out how to do it more often than not? Because certainly even the successful artists and designers I know, it's still hit and miss a lot of times, whether they get that right. So I think that maybe for me, maybe some of the unlearning is unlearning a bit of the cynicism, a bit of the maybe sometimes kind of ideological push to be in a constant state of critique. Because I also think being in a constant state of critique is unsustainable. I don't think it's good for people, having known lots of activists and lots of people trying to do really good, important work, and watching a number of them burn out from kind of being in that state all the time. And the tragedy of that's a personal tragedy, but then it's a tragedy for the movement that they're trying to propel, because then the movement loses them, right? So I think it is important to figure out how to maintain your criticality and exercise that where it's really needed, but also be able to be like, what, I'm actually gonna do this out of purely like, aesthetic reasons or reasons of delight, like I said, or something like that, because it's gonna give me pleasure and I know it's gonna give other people pleasure.
That's a very good answer, thank you.
I just want to add something. Like I totally agree. Like I made like an exercise with my students, like where I asked them to make something positive, and they weren't able to make anything positive. I think that is like the extreme example of like where we are currently with like deconstructive methodologies. And I think like the students, they don't know how to approach, basically build a sort of like a grant narrative or something like this, even though like grant narrative has been critiqued and so on, like they can't not bring about a vision honestly, because they sort of like find that it's uncool, it's not ironic, it's not something like this. So I feel this is like one of my kind of like main switch that happened to me like in the last like 3 years is attempting like to to bring about like positive visions and things like that. And my students are unable and still unable, even though if I push it.
My experience has been quite different, and I think that my students are very anxious and engaged in trying to speculate on very positive futures and see themselves as being individuals that can help to bring that forward. And I actually find in my world that there's a lot of inertia to change, that people actually want to keep things the way that they are in many ways rather than challenge that. I teach design for equity, which is advocating for undesigning systemic structures and unlearning implicit biases that underpin anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism in order to try and design a more equitable future. I wrote a paper on racism and access to medicines that explores structural racism as corruption that benefits states. And so the whole purpose, and I think that that's probably maybe what I hear that's lacking is that a purpose as I see it of deconstructing and in sort of the undesigning piece is to think next step, which is how do I redesign so that we can, and with whom do a redesign in order to have these strategies that are empowering and these strategies that bring joy and these, but bring joy to many, and don't just benefit, to think outside of ourselves for, what is beneficial for the many. And so I think that you're right, Milan, to talk about deconstructing just for the purpose of deconstructing is not enough. The other part of that is that now how do we rebuild? But I think in order to rebuild, we have to understand what the structures are that are impeding those positive futures that we're trying to get to.
Chinouk, anything you want to add on this topic, this idea of empathy and romanticism in design education?
Yeah, so I was just thinking about the current zeitgeist of the students that I usually talk to, which is, to be fair, very critical. It's a critical design climate in which I move. But I also think we're at a point where it's necessary, especially speaking from my personal experience and context, as I'm part of an educational system that is built on Western, white, and strong colonial context while stemming myself from a post-colonial heritage. So it's this constant conversation that I have with students. And for me, the bit of empathy is then reigns a bit stronger than the romanticism. But when I do see that a student holds this element in their practice, I definitely tell them to actively engage with it and hone in on it, because it is, you just don't, well, I don't come across it that often that that students' work revolves around hope and joy. And I think the discipline ultimately does need hope and joy, because so much of artistic research revolves around doom scenarios and warning signs. But to come back to empathy, I think that's the base for how I deal also with educating and tutoring and mentoring, because it also stems from the lack that I received while I was in art education. So I want to facilitate that for students. And I think it's a void that needs attention. Yeah.
Thank you. I would like to conclude this talk with a few words. Thank you to our guests, first of all, for being here. It's quite appreciated. From a young tutor and young educator point of view, this was very helpful and very encouraging. Fairly positive, yes. Fairly positive as well, encouraging. And yes, I will be opening the floor to questions now to our audience that are here. Mitch, do you have one? Amazing. We will hand you a microphone so that everybody can hear you.
As an instructor, what perspective or radical thought that you hold dear and has met with most resistance?
You want to repeat it a second time
No.
just for the
No,
sake of it?
absolutely not.
Thank you.
As an instructor, what perspective or radical thought, like in teaching pedagogy, that you have, that you wish to impart? Like I heard, like Milan's very clear on that. Like I hate these kids waving a cane, and but that is most resistant to change. Like from your like your own personal presentation of something, like that you want to. Like say there's a new way that's being confronting you as an instructor, and it's like may or may not be better, but it's like you don't want to bend. You know, is there anything like that, or do you just go like, no, it's the way it's been taught? I know that there's a lot of values that get broken down, and it's for the better. But is there some things that you feel should be maintained from your own, like not from like general perspective, but from your personal perspective that you've learned, like that's ingrained in your own persona? Does that make sense?
To me, it does. Do any of our panelists want to answer Mitch's question?
Thank you.
I can try. Just to make sure that I understand correctly, like if there's something that I would like to maintain, that
Something that you believe is very important to be passed on from your. Something that you believe is really important that should be passed on, but like meets with resistance and like may be controversial or something that you just feel like it needs to be said.
I have many, like, but one of them is basically I would like to maintain rigor in evaluation, for example. I'd like to have a fair assessment of someone that like over delivers should get like really high grades, and someone who under delivers should get like low grades. I've gotten a lot of resistance from the departments themselves about grading. So this is something that I kind of gave up, but I feel bad about it. I feel bad that I unfortunately cannot like almost can no longer not pass students. That's something that I have a grudge a little bit about it, but I accepted it and I decided to go along with everyone's successful, everyone's good, everyone is doing perfect. So I'm going along because I don't want to sort of like lose my job. But this is something that if I think it's worth fighting, because it discourages many like very talented students to over deliver and to make more of what is asked of them, and I feel like it helps. It could penalize also our greater good, like in the future. Like I feel like we should maintain that education should be difficult. Projects that people are doing should be difficult. We should not constantly remove, the volume of the assignment, the kind of quality of the assignment. So that's, I guess, it's a bit controversial currently, but I feel it's like worth maintaining long term.
Does anybody else want to answer Mitch's question?
Yeah, I think for me it's two things maybe. It's properly presenting the work and being present, like physically present in the space when other people are presenting. And even I know this is a bit hypocritical with me being online and participating in this talk online. But I think peer-to-peer feedback when you're presenting for a group needs, you can learn so much from being present in the space from students. And I guess with just the pandemic and being able to work hybrid and host hybrid, there's for us here that people can participate in presentations online while being on a train. So I think it annoys me.
Can I just pick up on that last part? Because I've been thinking about it a lot, and I know everybody's been thinking about it a lot, but I want better language to describe why that's important. Because I think it's very important. I think a lot about it in terms of these days about research assistants in my research studio and what happens when they're all in the studio together instead of working remotely. Like, we made it through the pandemic, right? So, and we were productive and stuff like that. But then being back in the space now and being with them and seeing sort of all the small interactions that happen, all the things that get sparked off in conversation, the relationships that get built, the people helping each other in ways that just did not happen when we were remote from each other. But then being, asked, like, why do we have to be in the space? Like, why do I have to come in, right? And only having this kind of very vague feeling-based vocabulary for describing it. So if anybody has that vocabulary or knows people who talk about that well, I would love it, because in my heart, and also I'm worried about, like, I'm just an old dude who, that's how I grew up working, was in studio co-present with people, and so I'm just stuck on that. So anybody who might have help in thinking about that, because I do really think it's important, particularly for interdisciplinary teams. Right. And so a big part of what you have to do with interdisciplinary teams is understand how people who are coming from other disciplines think about the world, engage with the world, practice their craft, what is their world of concern, those sorts of things that are very difficult to get absent sort of ambient, casual interactions.
Yeah, I think that I feel quite strongly about thanks for that, Jason, about sort of the interdisciplinarity and the interdisciplinary teams, and how do we create that? Because we come up with better designs when we have diverse perspectives at the table, rather than just sort of working by ourselves. And so, in the world in which we are, and this is interesting because I am challenged, just like each and every one of you are challenged, between how it is that you create that kind of team work, how do you build those relationships, and how do you support engagement in the environment which we are today, in which there are a number of ways in which students can engage, both in a hybrid environment, as opposed to only in person. And kind of an interesting example, I was teaching a class, and there was a student who, they were a UX UI designer, right? And so as part of during the class time, they were working, and they were like having collaborations online using and we use a lot of Miro and other kinds of online collaboration tools, but they were doing that with individuals from part of their design team that were across the globe, because she worked for a global company. And so I think at some point, in some way, we also need to be able to teach students how to be able to work in that kind of environment as well, because when they leave us, they're going to, depending upon what kind of practice that they're in, they may very well find themselves in an environment where they are having to work on design ideas with somebody from the United States, somebody from Canada in the same time zone, but it might be somebody from India, somebody from, Japan and, Germany, and everybody is different people on that team. And so, and that's going to be in online collaboration. So I think that engagement is the piece. And Chinook, it's okay. You're engaged, even though you're online. When you're teaching and you just see a little bubble, a circle on the screen, now I'm not so certain about engagement, but it really, it's okay. And I can say that because I'm online too. But but definitely, I think that we need to be able to have students who graduate and leave and are able to work in both kinds of environments.
Milan, did you want to add anything?
I was just I'm having the same issues as you guys, like in terms of like presence, like physical presence. Like it bothers me that like that we sort of something happened during COVID and then we lost that part of like the studio. So like for me, like the way we've been doing it at La Salle College is like the machines, creating like different classrooms, like so the students actually need to be there in the space. So maybe I was just going to say that like potentially it's not just about like humans, but it's also like what is the infrastructure of the classroom. So depending on what kind of classroom I teach, I have more engagement versus another. So I think it has to do also with machines, tools, and stuff that we need to provide design students so they really feel like they should be there, because a lot of the work could be like literally done like remotely, So it's, I just wanted to add that about the spaces themselves.
Thank you to our panelists for these very thoughtful responses. Do we have any other questions in the crowd? Martin?
Thank you all for your insights. It's very interesting. I just want to add the notion of good design. I just want to bounce back. I think there's one aspect that I want to point out is the importance of design research. Since we're a symposium on research and design, I think there's something that we need to really focus and emphasize and prioritize and valorize, because design doesn't have a long history of research. And take the example of good design. Of course, good design has been defined in certain ways by the modernists, from the Bauhaus, and someone like Dieter Rams had 10 principles of what good design is. And from my perspective, good design, we don't really know how to do good design anymore. We had the answers, say, in the post-war period, in the 1960s, the era of the, performance and automobile speed, so we destroyed the certain neighborhoods of the city by, tracing highways. We did it in Montreal, it happened in Toronto, it happened in Boston, all throughout the city. So the good design at that period was the idea of, flying back home in the suburbs with your V8 engine, doing like 5 miles a gallon, and that was good design at the time. And so now we're realizing in this period of time, all the mess that this idea of good design put us in. We're pollution, danger, and the cities that have been, then people have done research, good research, Jane Jacobs, Death and Life of Great American Cities. And thanks to those insights, now we understand that wasn't, this idea of what good design used to be cannot be used as a model today, and so that's why what I say to my students, everything needs to be redesigned. So we know how to do comfortable chairs, we know how to create plastics and pack them in styrofoam, but then it has a very negative and destructive impact on the environment. So basically, we're not doing good design anymore. So we need to figure this out. We need to do research. We need to find new materials, new processing, new ways of transporting things. Everything needs to be rethought and deconstructed in a way. So that's why I think design research is so important, because we were talking about the pandemic. What happened is we turned our heads to medical science, and we said, you find the solution. And we knew they would find the solution. We knew the vaccine would come, and it kind of was the solution. But what about design? I'm concerned by, we talk about the industry, like someone, okay, design a chair that has no impact on the environment, or even better, that improves the environment. And falling leaves, like, the famous book, about cradle to cradle. So we need to design, if we could do that, create a system that regenerates, and the model found in nature. So I think there's so much work to be done now in this era to find better solutions, and to do research, and to find better answers about what good design is, and to teach that at school, so that the future can be brighter. Because there's no way to be a designer if you're not an optimist. I'm sorry. Otherwise, you just go home.
Yeah.
That's a good point, Martin. Thank you for adding all this information to these questions. I'm guessing you've been holding it back the whole talk. Tarcisio, you have a question?
Yep. Thank you all for this amazing panel. I just have a question on how, and this is me as a student posing this question to you as educators. How do you navigate and assess students' personal context? Especially me, I feel like I'm asking this question because I am in a very different context as my colleagues. I'm an international student. I'm also from a marginalized group, and I feel like I've always felt like that. There's a lot of layers that I have to, a lot of steps that I have to take to kind of like be at the same field or at the same level as some colleagues of mine. And this is not personal at all to any of you. But it's just, how do you access that? How do you navigate through that? Because I think that you can go to a classroom and put everything into like the same level of everything. There's also the way of like in grad school, there's like this full-time thing that you have to study a lot, but also you have to pay the bills, so you gotta work. It's not just like, okay, I'm gonna focus on my education now. There are people that has privilege to just afford just study, but there's also this study work condition. And how do you navigate through that? How do you assess that? And how do you manage that? Thank you.
I think that's a really tough challenge, and that comes up all the time, constantly. In my mind, at this moment right now, it actually connects to your comment about rigor. And so, in thinking about how do you create a rigorous learning environment, but then maintain flexibility so that you can address students who are having challenges that maybe, say, outside the norm of the classroom, right? And these, I mean, I think all the educators here know that this can vary quite. You end up in conversations with students sometimes where, you're deep in their tragedy, right? And trying to figure out what little you might be able to do from your perspective as an educator to just sort of help alleviate that in some way, because we can't solve it. So, and I've gotten more like this, I think, the older I've gotten, the sense of more flexible and more like, okay, what is the point here? Is the point like this assignment needs to be in on this day? Is the point to get a good result out of the student? Is the point to make sure the student doesn't drop the class? Is the point to make sure the student doesn't leave university, right? Like, these are all kind of different levels that I think, I like to see educators, I like to think I am, and I like to see educators who have the flexibility to try to think through those things. But it's a really great question, and I think something that hopefully we're all actively trying to sort of figure out. So, but I gotta go. I wasn't quite expecting it to be this long. So thank you very much, Raf.
you.
Thank you, my fellow panelists. It's nice seeing you again and meeting you guys online. And thank you, everybody, for coming. But I gotta run.
Thank you, Jason.
Oh, I have like these challenges like on daily basis. Basically, it's like it's a constant dilemma. Like how do you deal with like personal situation? And we do hear like a lot of personal stories, and like generally like everyone is like flexible. Lately, to all of that, I think like the financial challenge of my students has been like really like specifically becoming an issue. Just a couple of days ago, like I asked a student to go and I looked at her garment, and she was overlocking with red a thread, but the garment was black, let's say, something like that. And I said like, well, go and buy like red the proper thread. And she told me it's $32 downstairs. And then basically like it really suddenly hit me that like this person actually cannot afford to complete her project like in the proper way. So I've been like like I have empathy like for these things, and like it bothers me. And like this is like another something with my colleagues, like with Raf and with everyone, we've been like trying to address like also the problem with stagflation, inflation, and so on. And we also have a lot of like international students that are having like a real hard time finding apartments, even in Montreal. So whether we want or we don't, whether we don't want to or want to, we deal with this like on every day. And I think like that's part of like being a good teacher, is to kind of like understand where you have how to be flexible yet not lose basically the entire goal, which is to make everyone deliver at their best and so on. But it's a big challenge currently, especially financially. I'd say like it's really difficult for our students.
Do you want to add something, Kathy or Chinook?
Yeah, I think so. I'm in a bit of a privileged position because I often talk to students in either small groups or individually. So it's easier to create a safe space for students to also notify me when they're in a tough spot financially or emotionally or mentally or whatever. So it becomes easier for me for me to deal with it, or to find a proper way to work with it and be flexible in terms of finding what the student needs. The point for me is that the student learns, to reiterate Jason's last comment before he fled the space. But and maybe I'm aware of this, but maybe I also crossed the line in terms of trying to facilitate to a student's needs by, for instance, using my institutional budget to loan to students for printing or for buying stuff in the shop. It's just, if I can cheat the system for a student, I will. It's the way that I try to deal with creating environments in which students can thrive for the 4 or 2 years that they study.
Yeah, and I don't have much more to add to what has already been said, other than I think that it's our responsibility to look holistically at the student and all of their needs, and where they have flexibility whenever possible, and to plug students into resources that are available on campus, whether it is food, if there's food insecurity, or figuring out how to get a transit ticket or the like, and to create that safe space in the classroom where where all different kinds of perspectives that the student brings, like they can show up in the classroom as their authentic self. Because I heard that also in the question is that maybe I don't feel like I can show up as my authentic self. And so it's not just the physical needs of a student, but also their emotional needs that we want to attend to so that students can feel safe. So that's the only thing I would add to what's already been said.
Thank you. And thank you to Tarcisio for this wise question. I think it ties back to this idea of empathy in design education. I mean, after all, design is nothing but social, and we educators are human after all. So I think empathy has its place in design education as much as anything else. If we don't have any more questions, I would like to invite the people who are here to walk around, see the exhibition, and then follow us to the vernissage, which is happening in the EV building, which is just across the road on the 6th floor. There'll be drinks and food. And thank you to our panelists again for being here. I know it's very late or either very early for Chinook. So thank you so much for being with us at this moment. And thank you, Kathy, as well, Mila, and to Jason, who has left.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes, so thank you for inviting me as well. Thank you.
And thank you to everyone here. Thank you to Raf for bringing these wonderful people together to have this conversation at Force-Space today. And thank you everyone here for your comments and your questions. We're going to be closing up the Zoom and the live stream now, but for those of you in this space, feel free to check out the exhibitions and head on over to the vernissage. Have a lovely rest of your day, everyone.